Uh, Excellent. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you are with us. And I'm very happy that you were able to join us today. During the last decades, my name is George Tatar from the Budapest Center for Dialogue and Mass Atrocities Prevention. And I will start with some welcoming words, and then we shall start also the other parts of the event. So, during the last decades, globalization removed a lot of barriers and crashed down a lot of walls between people coming from different cultures and civilizations. And during the era of globalization, people across continents have succeeded to develop countlessly fruitful relationships and prosperous partnerships in the sectors of trade, industry and agriculture, innovation, finance and communication. And thus the living conditions of billions have substantially improved. In my reading, one of the main secrets lying behind the success that people across cultures have established win-win situations, and through taking mutual account of interests and motivations, and they strive to find the points and perspectives which connect them instead of playing zero-sum games. Interestingly, globalization has led to much less fruitful results in the field of politics. Numerous politicians have built up walls and barriers between nations and within nations, and impeded collaboration in multilateral frameworks, particularly during the last decades. Their attitude has been built on divide, enmity, hatred, and conflict that have led to wars, mass violence, and extreme crimes, and in best cases, to zero-sum arrangements. Autocrats and populists are in the lead of divide and hatred. Generations grow up in hostile environments. Generations perceive enmity and hatred as obvious anomalies that accompany the activities of politicians. Hatred between people with diverse values is on the rise. The potential of violence grows. These trends are heartbreaking and known not only in the global south, but also in the global north. Currently, the efforts which aim to counter these poisonous phenomena focus primarily on proactive communication, development of effective counter-arguments, awareness raising, sometimes on isolation or even exclusion of the extreme persons from the mainstream politics. Regrettably, the tool of dialogue plays an insufficient role, despite the fact that, as we know, dialogue allows for finding long-term and sustainable settlements of complex problems, and is able to transform even hostile situations into peaceful collaboration across cultures. These considerations have inspired us to both make and generate additional efforts for disseminating culture of dialogue and facilitating dialogue in Hungary. To that end, last year, we started planting dialogue trees as symbols of dialogue in Budapest, and we also facilitating dialogue between national radicals on the one side and Jewish, LGBTQI and Roma communities on the other. Actually, they have not been in any sort of communication with each other before that. But whilst seeing the numerous efforts in a dialogue facilitation and capacity building, we also got the impression that these activities are a bit isolated, fragmented, and the voice of dialogue community is not strong enough. We have therefore also decided to expand our ambition and to the international dialogue community and launch this initiative, and an initiative to help its better integration, pool our expertise, experience, and energies, and amplify our voice. This webinar is the first step on this road, where we wish to not only create synergies, but also we wish to point to the fact that dialogue is an effective alternative to the confrontational and hostile politics. We would like to continue our endeavor by organization of further webinars and roundtables. Today, we shall focus on sharing experience in successful dialogue facilitation and capacity building and the challenges and tasks ahead of us. We invited practitioners who have facilitated dialogues in extremely hostile or complex situations that we call tough dialogues. By this, we wish to demonstrate that even in extreme cases, there are good chances to transform vitriolic relations into peaceful communication and create by that the preconditions and frameworks for addressing conflictual and complex challenges. We have also invited practitioners who have done excellent jobs in capacity building and in the field of education. These colleagues will share their experience and with us, with you. And afterwards, in the last part of this webinar, we also intend to jointly reflect a bit on how we could advance on this road and speak up. And we shall also invite you to actively take part in this brainstorming. I'm very pleased to see many of you who've joined us. I do hope nobody will feel offended whom I don't welcome personally, but I am happy that you are here with us, and thank you for your time and energy. And before starting the event, let me also share with you the idea that we shall record this event. We shall disseminate this record. And definitely all those who will want that we shall delete their names or their picture from the record, we shall do that. Please inform us in this case afterwards, after the event. And definitely I will be happy that if you will also disseminate this record with us. And now also another technical information that I will also share the list of participants with all of you in order that to also facilitate the communication within the dialogue community. And please also inform us after the event if you don't want that you will be on our list, which will be circulated within our circle. So now, after this short but not as short as I hoped introductory, let me ask the colleagues to play the video of the special advisor of the UN Secretary General on prevention of genocide, Mrs. Alice Wairemu Deritu. And for sure that you know that the UN dedicates a particular attention to preventing mass atrocity crimes, countering hatred, hate speech, and in parallel, UN is very strongly has a very strong political will to promote the cause of dialogue and dialogue facilitation. Ms. Neritu has been a recognized voice in the field of peace building and violence prevention. She has led mediation efforts in reconciliation processes in Kenya and later on in other African settings. She also served as a commissioner for national cohesion and integration commission in Kenya. She is also a founder of the community of voices for peace and pluralism. This is a network of platform of African women, and she also serves as a member of the Kenya National Committee on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and War Crimes crimes against humanity, and all forms of discrimination. So, dear colleagues, please just try playing the video.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the Budapest Center for Dialogue and Mass Atrocities Prevention for inviting me to be part of this important meeting. It's a great honor for me to participate in this event about the importance of dialogue to address hatred and prevent atrocity crimes, by which I mean genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. I apologize for not being able to attend the entire debate due to prior commitments, but I'm glad to have the chance to address participants through this video message. This topic is very close to my heart. I have long-standing experience in mediating through dialogue, including in armed conflict situations and contexts at risk of atrocity crimes globally. It is also very timely. Around the world, conflicts between people, communities, and states are often defined by a lack of dialogue. Regrettably, we see the use of force again and again as the preferred option over negotiation, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and direct dialogue, which are the mechanisms enshrined in Article 33 of the United Nations Charter for the peaceful settlement of disputes. This is despite the obvious impacts of violence on peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. However, it is my firm belief that dialogue is the first step to be made if we are committed to peace and atrocity prevention. We do know that wars often happen because of a lack of leadership that recognizes a need for dialogue. Dialogue is therefore central to my mandate as Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide in addressing long-term structural issues and fostering mutual understanding so that conflicts do not have a chance to escalate into violence and lives can be saved. Facilitating dialogues is not easy, and I'm mindful of the challenges. Some of the peace dialogue processes I have been involved in took months or even years before we found a way forward accepted by those in conflict. It is important to design the dialogue, agree on a roadmap with those in conflict, with key signposts of where you are going and when you intend to get there, and then begin the process. It may be neither easy nor quick, but it surely pays out in the long term. Dialogue presupposes willingness first and foremost to be open to the other, learn about a different perspective, and actively listen. Even when the two parties disagree, dialogue allows for finding a solution based on reciprocal respect. Through dialogues, worldviews, assumptions, misunderstanding, examination of reasons behind the use of discriminatory, blaming, and judgmental language towards another can be questioned. The United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech defines hate speech as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has emphasized that hate speech is a menace to democratic values, social stability, and peace. Openness to self-analysis may help one identify deep-rooted prejudices that underpin the use of hate speech and foster acceptance and respect. All past genocides, including the Holocaust, the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994, and the genocide in Srebrenica in 1995, have been accompanied or preceded by hate speech. In those cases, hateful language fueled negative emotions that escalated to genocidal violence. Openness to dialogue is a step towards addressing hate speech and understanding that stereotypes and stigma form the basis for discriminatory action. Often, the parties with very conflicting viewpoints have difficulties engaging in direct dialogue and need the assistance of a third party to facilitate the conversation. My office has, over the years, engaged with actors such as religious and traditional leaders who facilitate difficult conversations. Across the world, these actors facilitate building bridges between people and communities and help develop narratives that are inclusive and embracing of diversity and that can help solve conflicts and prevent atrocity crimes. My office will continue building capacities of various actors in using dialogue in the context of atrocity prevention. I welcome the opportunity this webinar presents to explore ways to enhance the capacity of communities around the world to engage in dialogue about tough issues. Effective dialogue requires continuous learning to attentively listen, communicate needs, and accommodate solutions that address the necessities of both parties. I wish you a successful debate, and I look forward to receiving the result of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After this very interesting welcome message of the special advisor, I think all of you are encouraged to enhance further the international community. And right now, I would like to give the floor for the keynote speech, as indicated in the program, to Mr. Mohammad Darafsheh, who is currently the Director of Strategy at the Jivat Haviva Center for Shared Society. Between the years 2005 and 13, he served as co-director of the Abraham Fund initiatives. Mr. Darafsheh is considered as a leading expert on Jewish-Arab relations. He presented lectures and papers at the European Parliament, NATO defense colleagues in many places, the World Economic Forum, Club de Madrid, US Congress, Israel's presidential conference. He also won the Peacemakers Award from the Catholic Theological Union and the Peace and Security Award of the World Association of NGOs. In 2009, he served as a member of the National Committee, which drafted coexistence education policy, and he also frequently appears on Arab satellite TV. He's currently member of many executive boards. Let me mention just the three-sector roundtable at the Prime Minister's office and the strategic planning team of the Authority for Economic Development of the Arab sector of the Prime Minister's office as well. So, Mohammed, the floor is yours. The colleagues will have the possibility to pose questions to Mohammed in the question and answers session.
Thank you very much, my friend. And it's wonderful to be in this forum. And it's also wonderful to see some friends that I've recognized and worked with in the past. I'll be very quick, mainly because the time is very limited. And I will ask the basic questions. Why do we dialogue, and what type of dialogue approach, what theory and practice do we work with? Most of my work has been on the Israeli-Palestinian aspect, whether it is Palestinian citizens of Israel with Jewish citizens of Israel, or the Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens in general, with the state institutions. You know, Israel has a 21% Palestinian minority as citizens of the state, not speaking about the West Bank and Gaza. I'm not speaking about the occupied territories. These are leftovers of the Palestinian people that stayed in what became the state of Israel. I always like to start by saying this is not a migrant population that migrated to Israel. This is, I always say, Israel migrated to me. I did not migrate to Israel. And as such, it created the dissonance that Israel defines itself as the state of the Jewish people, not the state of its citizens. And that leaves 21% of the population in a place, in a situation that say, okay, where's our state? So there's a political dialogue, let's call it the political discourse about whose state is it? Is it the state of the Israelis, or is it the state of the Jews? If you affirm that it is the state of the Jews, you basically leave 21% of the population feeling stateless, and they are not part of that national priority. So that's what I call the vertical debate about the identity of the state, a debate that has not ended. Actually, it is a heating debate, and it's hard to assume that there will be that there will be a very fast, quick resolution for that discourse. The other debate and the other dialogue that we're dealing with is what I will identify as the horizontal aspect, the social, cultural, educational dialogues that need to take place to try to challenge the structure of a segregated society. 92% of Palestinian Arab citizens live in separate Arab towns and villages, and 99.9% of the educational system is segregated. The schools are segregated, and the result of this is that you end up with more than 65% racism rate among high school kids, both from the Israeli Jewish side and the Israeli Arab Palestinian side. So we produce racist youth, we produce racist results in our educational system, and a very polarized society that lives also under the umbrella of an active conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian cross-Green Line, cross-border conflict. And traditionally, we dealt with 1 out of 3 types of dialogue, and that's what's called the social contact theory. In conflict resolution, it's called the social contact theory. The goal of the social contact theory is to create familiarity, to break the divide between the groups, to engineer encounters between the different groups, and create some level of familiarity so that we do not see the other only through the lens of security. We do not see the other only through the lens of political confrontation, but someone who's familiar, someone that has a name, that we do not talk about the Jews, we do not talk about the Palestinians, but we are able to talk about individual faces, humanize. The goal is to humanize the other side. The goal is to break stereotypes, because active conflict produces stereotypes. The biggest stereotype is that we need to be afraid of them, and as such, we dehumanize them. Dehumanization is what we call a defense mechanism, usually, that we apply in order to justify our racism or in order to justify our hate that we develop to that other group. And that's why the social contact theory is really very important, to put a human face, to put a name, to give a family story, to share even as simple matters as what did you have for breakfast that morning, and suddenly realize that you had the same kind of food, you like the same kind of strawberry, you like the same kind of apples. It gives a human touch to the relationship, so it allows people to stop thinking of the other as a non-human enemy that has a horn or has a tail, and as such we can justify our continued hate towards them. The problems with this theory and with our practice and evaluation, we've seen problems with this theory. It doesn't change reality outside. Reality outside, as I mentioned, is not just separation and segregation. The reality outside has also hierarchy, where the state says that Jewish or ethnic identity is more supreme than the civic identity of the citizens. So to be Jewish, it means you are more privileged in society. So to bring people into a wonderful engineered environment where they're able to humanize each other, they're able to break stereotypes, they're able to create familiarity with each other, that does not change reality outside, specifically because the volume of those dialogues are not big enough. They barely touch a fraction of society, and it's mostly bottom-up approach and not top-down approach. There's no structured policy to make dialogue as a policy where every young person goes through this, and then you can create what we would consider a tectonic shift in humanization of the other. Right now, it's still sporadic level type of activities, so the magnitude does not challenge hierarchy, the magnitude does not challenge the wider reality outside. The other problem we find is it's called expiration date. We can bring people to our campus at Givat Haviva Center. We know how to engineer activities that after a certain amount of time, whether it is 1 day or 3 days, we can break down those stereotypes and we can bring people to the place that they can see the other as a human being. And believe me, we see many children wanting to stay much longer, and they even sometimes cry for having to go home that quickly. But the problem is that they do go home. They do go home, and they start what we call returning home syndrome. And returning home syndrome brings them back to the original stereotypical thoughts that they had before, and that does not allow them to be able to maintain a constant constant belief in the new engineered reality that we created for them. So if we are doing this work and we see that it is not delivering enough, what do we do? What's the next stage in our work? And the next stage we found has to be in bringing reality. Very often when we engineer these kind of meetings, participants say this was not this was a fake meeting. Why? Because we didn't talk about the problems. We only talked about being nice to each other. We only humanized each other, but we did not allow the elephant into the room. We did not talk about the hard problems. We did not talk about the killings that happened over the weekend. We did not talk about the 9 Palestinians that were killed in Jenin. We avoided the problems. And as such, we started seeing a demand to talk about narratives, to talk about the problems, to talk about identity, the identity of the state, the identity of the public sphere, the identity of the history that we adopt, the flag, the national anthem, who owns the public space, or who defines what is the identity of the collective that we live in. The goal of this discussion is to understand the differences, to identify and legitimize narratives. Believe me, every time we have a meeting between youth or even mayors, they start talking about what happened today, what happened last week, but they start what we call backtracking. They start backtracking in narratives of what happened in the previous, in 2016, who started the wave of violence? Was it in Gaza? It goes back to 1967, who started the war that ended up with occupation of the West Bank and Gaza? Who started the war of 1948? We still have disagreements and different perspectives of how that war started. What was the Balfour Declaration? Was it just unjust, the Sykes-Picot plan? All the way back to who did Abraham want to sacrifice? Was it Isaac or was it Ishmael? And we still debate this. We still disagree on who was supposed to be the victim under the knife of our common father, Abraham. That in a narrative debate, you acquire a lot of knowledge. You get to know the other very well. You get to understand the other very, very well. The problem with this narrative debate is the maximum you can get out of it is agree to disagree. As we still do not agree who did Abraham want to sacrifice, we do not agree about the wave of violence that happened over the weekend. We do not agree who initiated it. We do not agree who started it. We do not agree who is who's the victim. Was it the Palestinian side? Was it the Israeli side? And each participant feels that they come as an ambassador, as a representative of their identity and narrative, and barely are able to go forward. This also needs very highly informed participants. And I would like to say, this is dangerous business. Don't do it at home, because you can get negative results from this identity if you approach it as standalone approach or standalone theory. We've seen in evaluation participants saying, oh, I used to hate Palestinians, now I know why. Or I used to hate Jews, now I know why. So that's why I say, don't do it at home. You need to be well trained in order to be able to lead such an approach. And but it's still, it comes with a very high demand, because it brings the problem in the room. It allows the elephant into the room. The third approach that has been developing over the last 15 years is what we call the mutual interests approach. The mutual interests puts cooperation in the essence. Let's try to cooperate. Let's try to create independence and interdependency, and let's try to create sustainability. We can basically like or dislike each other. That's the first theory, which is the social contact theory. We can agree or disagree on narratives and identity, but we have mutual interests. The mutual interests are we share the same environment, we ride the same buses, we go to the same universities, we have the same workplaces. So how should we do that? How should we manage life until we solve the bigger problem? Meanwhile, we have life that needs to go on, and we need to try to develop those kinds of mutual interests. The problems with this theory of dialogue, it tends to avoid conflicts. It tends to also be seen as a fake engineered type of cooperation. It's usually temporary because interests may vary, and it doesn't deal with the roots, the historic roots of the problem. But it has the highest level of sustainability. Because if you create connection between two neighboring towns, one Arab, one Jewish town, that cooperate on creating a joint industrial zone, and they benefit from the profit that comes from that industrial zone, believe me, they would want to have sustainability of that, because that improves the lives of both sides. If you bring in more Arab students into the high-tech industry in Israel, which is dying for more brain power to fill the need of the biggest industry in Israel, Israeli economy knows how to create space. We see this most successful in the medical industry in Israel, although the Palestinian Arab citizens are 21% of the population, but they constitute 35% of the medical industry. It's 23% of the doctors, 37% of the nurses, 55% of the pharmacists. What happened there? Israeli Jewish community created space out of need. The Arab community created capacity out of also need to have better jobs. And suddenly you have interdependency and cooperation in the medical industry, which in a year and a half ago, when everyone thought that hell broke loose and there were confrontations in mixed towns and villages, the medical teams closed the emergency rooms and staged counter demonstrations to say, we have gained something that is worth protecting. We've created enough cooperation and interdependency that we want to protect it. Now, where do we go from there? The recommended approach that I want to end with is that never apply one of these theories alone. It's never a standalone theory. You have to be multidisciplinary in your approach. You need to integrate the three different theories in some kind of a balance. It's never the same balance. It has to be client adapted. So if you're working with elementary school kids, the maximum you can do is social contact theory. If you're working with mayors of towns, then you need to focus more on the interest-based approach. If you're talking with leadership people or people of high level of, call it intellectual capacity, then you need to bring in more of the identity debate because they want to talk about the issues, they want to talk about the problems. But you also need to do a lot of what we call uninational preparation. Before you start binational work, you need to do a lot of uninational preparation so you can set expectations of what do you want to get out of this dialogue. Is this dialogue for the sake of dialogue and for the sake of just being nice and get to know your neighbor? Or is this dialogue that is going to result with something practical? Are we negotiators on behalf of our communities, or are we coming as individuals to have an experimental educational process? And most importantly is to talk about the post-dialogue maintenance. Because of the expiration element, we go back to our identities, our unique separate identities, our separate ethnic groups. How do you maintain the impact of the process that you created? I want to end with 4 quick examples, if you allow me, George. One, examples of projects. One of the projects that we created in 1995, it's called Children Teaching Children. You can Google it under CTC. Children Teaching Children is a project which tried to break the segregation in the educational system. We pair Jewish and Arab classrooms to study together 1 day every 2 weeks. And they study civics, they study history, and they study Arabic and Hebrew, the 2 languages. And the goal is to go through all the different 3 theories that I mentioned before. For this project, we won the UNESCO Prize for Peace Education. We're the only organization in the Middle East that received this prestigious prize. The other project, which we started in 2005, is Teachers Exchange, as a way to try to break the segregation educational system. We place Jewish teachers in Arab schools, and we place Arab teachers in Jewish schools. Now we have about 2,500 teachers in about 2,500 schools. That's almost half of the educational system that has a teacher from the other sector, what we call cross-sector program. We also have in our campus an IB, International Baccalaureate School. 1/3 are Palestinian citizens of Israel, 1/3 are Israeli Jewish citizens, and 1/3 are international students. You're welcome to send us your own candidates for next year program. And I want to end with a very fine program, very specific program. When we talk about dialogue, we need to talk about not just dialogue through language. We need to talk about dialogue through skills. So when we see that the Israeli job market in the high-tech industry that has almost 40%, controls 40% of the GDP, 40% of the economy in Israel is in the high-tech industry. It only has 7% Arab employees, comparing to 35% of the medical industry. So the medical industry is what we call an island of success. The high-tech industry is an island of failure. So is it only talk that we do, or do we create some kind of intervention, active intervention? Our active intervention has been identifying the best brains in the Arab, Palestinian Arab community in Israel already when they're in 8th grade, and start giving them academic courses in computer science already from 9th grade. By the time they finish high school, they have 50% of their undergraduate degree. By the age 19, they have their undergraduate degree in computer science, and they are exactly what the industry is looking for. Bright young people that are local, that are looking for jobs. We have success rate of 70% of the graduates getting a job within the first 3 months, and about 30% of them actually continuing for their master's degree. Why? Because we are identifying the best brains and pretty much channeling them to the biggest need in the Israeli Jewish society. Once they are in there, they change the culture of the workplace, and the workplace identifies the specific needs of them and adapts and changes in order to suit the needs of the employee, but also the employee needs to come with the right skills to live in a multicultural, diverse society. Because of time, I'm going to stop here. Otherwise, I'll probably continue for another 4 hours.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. It was very interesting. It shows, at least for me, how many sort of dialogues you can facilitate, and how much it is necessary that you combine the various approaches and methodologies. And you may not apply the same methodology to all dialogue facilitation. So this is also a lesson learned for us. Now we shall thank you very much. And as I said, you will also get most likely questions after the panel discussion. And now let's move to the next point of our program, when we shall have the panel of 3 highly experienced dialogue practitioners and experts, whom I will introduce when they will get the floor for their intervention. And in this within this dialogue panel, we shall firstly demonstrate the experience collected by these practitioners in the field of dialogue, in the field of tough dialogues, what they have already, survived, and what sort of challenges they have faced, and what sort of maybe lessons that they have learned. As a first panelist, let me introduce Ms. Mila Boyer, who is a founder and director of REOS Partners. That is a global social impact company which is specialized in multi-stakeholder collaboration. And they are specialists, particularly in situations of complexity, uncertainty, and conflicts. She has worked over 20 years on systemic initiatives, which involves collaboration among actors with divergent interests and perspectives. And she's also the lead author of a book, which I would like to recommend to your kind attention. This is the Mapping Dialogue, Essential Tools for Social Change. And this book outlines a variety of transformative dialogue tools and change processes. So those who will want to develop and facilitate dialogues might learn a lot from that. So Mile, the floor is yours. Please make a short presentation of your experience in tough dialogues. Mile.
Thank you, George, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you also, Mohammed, for your intervention, because I feel very aligned with what you presented. It's a big pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a few slides just to help you follow what I'm sharing. So the work that we do in RIOS, essentially the core of our work is really about, as George said, enabling dialogue and collaboration in contexts of divergent perspectives, where people don't agree with each other, where they don't like each other, and where they don't trust each other. In some situations, we work in conflict contexts. Recently, we've worked in Ethiopia, Syria, Afghanistan, Cyprus. But in some cases, we also just work in conflictual situations, such as when different stakeholders need to talk about genetic engineering or energy transitions or education or other issues that may be conflictual among different parts of society, but not necessarily in a context of violent conflict. Specifically in this kind of space of conflict and in the peace building space, what I want to focus on is what we've learned about the use of a future-oriented focus. So to enable divergent people to come around a shared table. And we have found, almost discovered by accident, but really found the power of a conversation about the future and a collective task of developing scenarios for the future to enable dialogue in such situations. This approach, which we call transformative scenarios, was born out of the transition from apartheid in the early 90s, when for the first time a group from across the political spectrum came together to develop scenarios for the future of their country. And our colleague Adam Kahane was invited to facilitate this process. He was an experienced scenario practitioner, but had never worked necessarily in a societal conflict situation. But he realized that by inviting people to talk about the future, they were able to sit down with their opponents. And so I find it important to just clarify what scenarios are, and in particular that they're stories. And human beings have always used stories to talk about things that are difficult, taboo, complex, to bring the elephant in the room, as Mohammed was saying. And so what we do is we bring diverse stakeholders with divergent perspectives who might not sit together at the table for any other common task, together to develop a small set of stories of possible future context and how those futures might come about. That's essentially the transformative scenarios approach. So just to emphasize, it's an approach where people basically access their imagination and need to engage in a creative task together. So why this is valuable in conflict contexts, what we've learned from doing this is, first of all, it lowers the barriers for people to sit down with their opponents by not insisting on, that should say agreement rather than collaboration, not insisting on agreement. So they don't have to agree on values or beliefs or the way forward necessarily. They just need to develop stories of possible futures. How might the future of our situation unfold? It helps people to lift the gaze to a wider context and a longer time horizon. So you kind of lift your gaze beyond the immediate short-term needs and to look 10 or 15 years into the future. If it's a conflict situation, look beyond a settlement, what might happen afterwards, for example, and you look further than people normally consider, and also the wider context. So what's happening in geopolitics, what's happening in the global economy, what's happening with climate change, and how does that affect us? And so it just lifts people out of the immediate focus of the tension that they're living in. It also broadens the conversation to include unusual suspects. So it's not necessarily only the people who are parties to the conflict. It's not just two sides, it's multiple perspectives. It's a multipolar, multidisciplinary conversation, and also cross-cutting perspectives. So if, for example, our recent work in Cyprus, someone from the LGBT community, a Greek Cypriot, might have more in common with Turkish Cypriots from the LGBT community than actually with other Greek Cypriots. And so you bring in these multiple cross-cutting perspectives as well to get a systemic view of the situation. Working with the future also allows for setting aside wishful thinking. So the assignment is not for people to create a fantasy of the future that they want, but rather to develop plausible stories of the future. And in so doing, they also submit their maximalist demands to scrutiny. So sometimes people on different sides of a conflict will have a maximalist position that they're advocating for. But when you have to look at what's plausible, rather than ignoring the conversation or refusing to talk about someone else's maximalist demands, you submit them to scrutiny and you realize that actually there is no future where you have your full way, and you have to explore, how may it actually unfold into the future? What are the real possibilities? And finally, it builds trust gradually without working on it directly. So trust is not a prerequisite for joining the process, but it's something that's built over the course of needing to collaborate together. George, do I have time for one more slide, or am I out?
You are practically out, but if you are quick, you can do that. Please go ahead.
So just
1 minute.
One last piece is about this invitation to sit down with your opponents. So what we realize is that this is not just about people's will. It's not just about you need to be willing to sit with your opponent. You need to be open-minded. But actually, people take a real risk when they sit down with their opponents. And one of those risks is the risk of being seen as a traitor. And we've seen that at the level of political decision makers, but also at community level or activists, they're accused of treachery when they sit down with their opponents. So we acknowledge the courage and the risk, and we accompany them on the full journey in order to support them to be able to take that step. And we lower the barriers to collaboration by not insisting on agreement, as I said, having no prerequisite, no sort of common bottom line, except being willing to talk and listen, putting in place confidentiality measures, making sure people participate as individuals rather than as representatives of institutions, and creating a welcoming atmosphere and meeting in a physically safe location. So I'm happy to talk more later, but I think my first slot is up. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting just for the audience to say a secret that we have agreed that each panelist will have 5 minutes for each question to respond, and I will be very strict. So thank you very much that you respect time. So now the second colleague who will share his experience with us is Steinar Bryn, who got his basic education in dialogue by focusing on the cultural dialogue between Europe and the United States. He works now at the Nansen Academy in Norway, which is located in Lillehammer. And as you may remember, Lillehammer hosted the Winter Olympics in 1994. And they were connected with Sarajevo, that hosted the Olympics in 1984. And that was the reason why I think partly Steinar built up a Nansen dialogue network, which helped to connect potential leaders from ex-Yugoslavia in a 3-month-long dialogue meeting, where he, over the years, there visited about 3,000 people from ex-Yugoslavia, the Nansen Academy in Lillehammer, which is a huge amount of people. And over time, these seminars have had to be shortened, and it was necessary to organize seminars locally. And then Steinar has facilitated more than 200 weekend seminars locally. Today he spends most of his time with lecturing, But let me also mention that he himself says that he is challenged now to start dialogue and reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine. And I wish a good luck on behalf of all of us to him in this endeavor. So, Steinar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm honored to be able to talk to a group like this. You're right. The challenge, of course, because Ukraine and Russia, they will be neighbors for the next, hundreds of years. And the work that needs to be done to rebuild trust is so enormous. But I was challenged to talk about some tough situations. And I think the focus on this webinar is very timely and correct, because people get the feeling that dialogue is some kind of a cozy talk. In my experience, dialogue between conflicting parties can be very, very tough and very, very hard. I will mention 3 examples from Kosovo. One seminar for the possibility of returning to the village where your house was destroyed, where you were, chased out. And we gather. And the whole seminar starts by one man getting up saying, pointing at another man in the room, how do you have the courage to even show up here after you burn down my house? And he goes on and he gives the evidence. And I personally, as a facilitator, I start to think, wow, how did he have the courage to come here after he burned down his house? He went on for about 40 minutes. And the lesson learned here is that in tough dialogues, you cannot have communication rules. This man had such a need to get out all that anger and all those accusations toward the other man. But then the other man got up and he responded. He probably used 40 minutes as well and responded to a lot of the evidence. If I had 15 minutes, I would have gone into the detail. But the whole point is they had not spoken for 8 years about this. These were 2 neighbors, literally living wall to wall. And the guy accused of burning down the home, he was the first family who got the television in the village. So the other guy, every night when they were small, came over to watch the television in the neighbor's house. Then they sat down for several hours and talked. And they started to realize that actually it was a completely different story. And I'm asking the accuser, you still believe he burned down your house? And he says, no, but my children, I can never convince my children that he didn't do it, because they have heard for 8 years that it was him. So lesson learned, no communication rules in real tough dialogues. The second is also with the same group. One Serb has been part of the municipality. An order is given to citizens of Kosovo, don't communicate with people in the parallel structure. So one man that has been part of many dialogue meetings with the same group, he leaves the municipality and joins the parallel structure. So at one dialogue meeting, before we start to talk, one person gets up and says, I will not be in this dialogue unless you expel that person. We will not talk with people that represent parallel community. And I start to argue. I often want to argue because, I'm not a neutral, impartial, but as a dialogue facilitator, I have to be neutral. I have to be partial. So in this moment, I start to argue because I really honestly believe you cannot invite people to dialogue and then kick them out. But I was wrong. I was wrong because by starting to argue, I presented myself as somebody with better knowledge, with better experience than those wanting him to leave. And they were ordered by their authorities to not talk with them. And I should have respected that. And I spent about a month to regain the trust from this group. The third example is shorter. It was International Commission for Missing Persons. Serbs, Albanians from Kosovo, they said, we don't want dialogue, we don't want to talk about reconciliation, but we have a common interest in finding missing persons. I said, okay, we don't need to talk about anything, just come. They came to Lillehammer, and for a couple of days, we didn't really talk about anything. And they said, aren't we going to talk, Steinar? I mean, you have invited us. And I said, well, we can start by asking each other some questions, things you wonder about. Maybe you can get some information. So we start to talk. And what is interesting, within a week, by the end of the week, they have shared stories. They have realized that we are in one way both victims of this conflict. You have lost your brother, I have lost my brother. You have lost your father, I have lost my father. And when they realized that commonality, there was a will to start to work together. And at the last day, I say, you're now going home. You Serbs, you will have those difficulties. You Albanians, you will have those difficulties. I will now divide you so you can tackle your own challenges. And they refused. They said, are you, after this week, are you going to be the one dividing us after we have realized that this is a struggle we need to do together? So for me, it's a very positive example of the strength of dialogue between people that arrived without even wanting to talk to each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Again, it's I hear new stories from you, Steinar. So and I'm very grateful for that. Now the third panelist is Harald Weinböck. Mr. Weinböck, he works as a practitioner and also as a researcher of good practice methods in prevention and rehabilitation in school and even prison settings, and focusing on right-wing extremism. He has founded in 2005 an NGO in Germany. It's called Cultures Interactive, which is today a framework partner of the national Prevent program, Live Democracy. And from 2011, he's worked very actively in the EU's radicalization awareness network, implemented numerous projects, and in particular, he developed the so-called dialogal approach of narrative group work in schools. So this narrative group work transforms principles in order to become a standard curricular module to be applied in schools. So he's a specialist in education as well. Harald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Georgie. And I put a little timer for my 5 minutes, so but don't hesitate to interrupt me in any way. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy and delighted to be here, and thrilled by what I've already heard. We are now moving on to an educational practice that I've tried to actually launch with policymakers in Germany and in Europe. So it's about schools, and as Georgie already said, or indicated that it's about group work in schools. I will also share a couple of slides to make things a bit easier. Here it's called again the narrative dialogue groups at schools, and now Georgie urged us to start out with a couple of tough dialogue or tough situations, and here we go directly, and I have to give you trigger warning. This is about one of the most challenging group in Eastern Germany, close to the Polish border, that we get into talking circles in which, as Steinar said, there is no communication rules. You just sort of open the floor, you manage the setting, you assure confidentiality, and you do a couple of things for safety and for confidence. And so I will use my first slide to just give you a few impressions of one of these, what happens in these groups, what is talked about in these groups, and what then narrative group work will deal with, hopefully with some success. That was a school which we learned then in the group work that Hitler salutes were given in front of teachers and teacher lounge and other staff, and that just happens in the school, not regularly, but sometimes happens. And We also found within our groups a small group of, called them swastika sympathizers. They had little metal iron swastikas hidden on them as sort of an ID, and it took a few weeks actually to get to know this, and then being able to actually start the dialogue or start asking them, what the whereabouts and what the context and where they get it and what it means and all that. And then there was one young person we have. I'm going to explain the setting in which we do in a later slot, because setting is very important. But we have a timeout in this. Of course, we need a timeout. The people get enraged and need to take a break. And one young man came out there, and we're talking about age 14, 15, maximum 16. And she said, well, but if Hitler and my grandpa were alive, we wouldn't have things like that here. And he meant the narrative dialogue group work. So just to give you an impression and to just single out one, possibly another more complex utterance, and here's a trigger warning. And it was otherwise quite nice 15-year-old a boy, but this is what he presented in order to open his input into the group, which he understood to be a very open floor, and then took use of. And then he just proceeded to tell the group and the two facilitators, and you don't have to read it, I will read that to you. He said, well, the whole Holocaust thing wasn't as bad as everyone says it was. It wasn't even that many people in the end. Jews were always persecuted anyway. It was just a bit unfortunate that Germany was so technologically advanced. We had the gas chambers. His presence is like we had the new Porsche, and someone had to do it anyway. Now, Germany has to put up with everyone's accusations about how wrong we were. So that is quite, this is quite hard stuff by a 15-year-old. And the question is, what can narrative group work, which I'm going to explain a little bit later, can do with it? I think it should be pretty evident to you, because you have so much experience in the kind of work, that arguing against that will probably not help a lot. And I think you're right on that assumption. And maybe another, it's actually all published, and of course you do get the slides. And I have another little thing to read to you, which is not ripe with any evident ideology. It's just about the teachers, and that they're not worth anything. They're not taken seriously in this class. And there's particularly this Miss Müller, who is a cow. She is an animal. I can't even look at her with the way she wears pants under her skirt. It makes me feel like vomit. I hate her. I'd like to kill her. So a very open, no, stop, trigger warning. It's not getting any worse. It's not getting anywhere with this kind of stuff, but just to give you an impression of what sometimes, only sometimes, at the most challenging situations, comes up if you open up the floor and gain young people's trust that normally are not reached by pedagogical measures at all. And with that, I yield any rest of my time and give back to Georgie.
Thank you very much, Harald. So it shows to the people that how diverse approaches could be applied, and how diverse the challenges are. So by this, the first round of questions is over, and let me switch to the second round, which will be about the experience in building up capacities, local capacities. It is not enough that we facilitate dialogue between people, between groups, but it is also important that the people learn the culture of dialogue, and also the capabilities. They will become able, they will become capable to conduct dialogues and to talk to each other, and communicate with each other in a dialogue mode. So my question would be to each of you. We shall start with Mile. What are your experiences in developing dialogue, local dialogue capacities? Mile, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So in our work, I mean, of course, I've written the book which introduces 25 different dialogue tools, and we have had some experiences with teaching dialogue, but most of the time we're not directly focusing on building capacities for dialogue. We'll work alongside local partners, but the work that we do is framed more as facilitating dialogue, and in that process we build capacities. And so the capacities that are built, unless it's with local partners who learn to do what we do, the capacities that are built are almost more a side effect of the work. That doesn't mean that it's not significant, because we work with decision makers and people from across society, and often they'll say that what they learned about dialogue and the tools that they learned is the most important impact of the process. So we'll have someone who said, I've realized through this process that I haven't listened for the past 20 years, or certain people saying they're using the tools in their work subsequently. But I think it comes in a little bit through the back door, because what we do is we connect to people's concerns, we connect to their discomfort, and we invite them into a process about the future because of that discomfort, that they want to be in a conversation about what's going to happen in the future about the things we care the most about. But because they have this common task in the transformative scenarios work of building scenarios for the future, they can't do that without dialogue, because people only see one part of the puzzle from wherever they sit in society, and they have to understand the perspective of others if they're going to build a coherent story that is somewhat aligned across these different perspectives. And so they quickly realize that they can't achieve their task without learning to dialogue. And so we do bring in some dialogue exercises. We bring in some dialogue language as well, where we establish a language with people where they learn to distinguish between different forms of communication. And we talk about four. So downloading, which is where you're just downloading what you already know, what's already in your head. It's as if your brain is a computer. And when you're listening to someone, you're just projecting what you're expecting them to say from what you've heard before. Debating, which is where it's more of a conversation that's about right and wrong, and focusing on your opinion about things. Then dialogue, which is more about inquiry, listening, having common questions at the center, speaking from experience. And then what we call presencing, which is about noticing what's happening in the here and now, and being able to have that conversation. What's happening in the here and now, and what does it tell us about our system? What does it tell us about our society? So we establish this language with people, and they're then able to, it's not to say that you should never download or debate, but you're able to have the language of differentiating. You start to learn to discern, when are we dialoguing and when are we not dialoguing, and how does that relate to actually a productive conversation that allows us to meet our goal, and how does it relate to power and other dynamics in the group. So we really build capacity through creating the experience. And I think also, I think one of the aspects of that is acknowledging the difficulty, acknowledging that in tough situations, you're not going to, as other speakers have said, you're not just going to slide into a beautiful conversation, but we kind of normalize that difficulty. We normalize the toughness. It's normal that you're arguing right now. It's normal that you can't agree. But let's stay in the process and work through these capabilities so that you can achieve the task that you're here to achieve. And I just want to say one other thing about what Mohammed said about the elephant in the room and arguing over the past. That the work we've been doing in Cyprus, for example, it's an island and a population that's dominated by conversations about the past. They argue about what happened 50 years ago, what happened 60 years ago, and they have different narratives and they're taught different things about what happened. And we spend 8 days with these people, and once in a while they talk about the past, but mostly they're talking about the elephant in the room. They're talking about the problems, but in the context of the future. And so it requires them to be creative. It requires them to be imaginative, and there's less possibility of debating. It's harder to debate the future than it is to debate the past. And so I think again that future-oriented dialogue helps to build that capability.
Thank you very much. It was interesting again. So I'm very much pleased to hear this sort of stories, and which helps to understand the situation. Okay, so Steinar, The floor is yours.
I think I was, in a way, it's a strange word to use, but I was lucky to live in Lillehammer, and lucky because of the connection we made with Sarajevo. I'm very glad to see Nebojsa here in the room, because he's been working in the Nansen Dialogue Center in Sarajevo for 20 years, and we've done a lot of work together in Bratunac, Srebrenica, Zvornik, Jajce, and what happened is that we got support from the Norwegian Foreign Ministry to make it possible to invite potential leaders to come to Lillehammer and sit together for 3 months. That's quite a long time. I doubt in 2022 that this had been even possible, because people don't have that kind of time today. When we designed, let's say, the training, it was not in the beginning defined as dialogue training, because people were unwilling to even talk about the important things. So in designing how we were living together, talking was one thing, but the social component and the physical component and the cultural component were equally important. I think that is maybe what Miller were talking about, when we cannot only stay together in the room when we talk. We have to be together around the clock. And people that are in conflict, ethnicity plays an enormous role in the beginning. But through living together, like we do at the Nansen Academy, we have a dormitory, we have eating facilities, we have educational facilities, you start to discover the multidimensional personality of the others. So an Albanian can say, I hate you as a Serb, but you sure can shoot the basket. Wow, do you like jazz music too? And we started to build respect in other areas of life. And I think that maybe our greatest success was to break down the ethnic principle as a way to organize life. And one more thing, we started to think a lot about space. So what does space do in terms of fostering dialogue and fostering communication? It's often neglected, but my town have spaces because we have an old-fashioned museum. When people go there, they discover a unique interest in architecture that has nothing to do with the war or the conflict. It has to do with houses built 300 years ago. We have a main street, which is kind of a fairy tale street out of a Grimm fairy tale. And this use of space and music, I think timing and the use of music, don't play old Yugoslav music too early, don't play it too late, but if you time it, a lot of people from ex-Yugoslavia know how to sing those songs, and they can sing them together. And even dancing is a very important part of building up. What we managed to do was to establish Nansen Dialogue Centers. But these centers, they were all dependent upon funding. And I want to address that issue because we are so dependent upon funding to keep the work going that when funding stops, we don't exactly know how to move forward. We don't have any project anymore. How to make people that have gone through training continue when there is no more project? Because the rotation in the international focus, the rotation in the international interest, even the rotation in embassies and international organizations present in a city like Sarajevo is so quick that I have the last 2 years been thinking specifically about if teachers still continue to go in their same classroom as they've always gone to, why do they need a project if they are committed to somehow promote the Nansen dialogue values and ideas? But it takes motivation and it takes continuous stimulation to make people see that this is something that we have to do in our everyday life. And the only way that you can continue is by having a network around you. And to invest in building a network is what we did. So when we invited people to come to Lillehammer, it was important that we invited friends of friends, because they knew each other and they could connect upon return. So there is a Nansen group in Mostar, in Sarajevo, in Pridor, in Jajce, and this Nansen network are starting to reach positions. So once potential leaders are now becoming real leaders. And my favorite example is Dritan Abasovic from Montenegro. He's the prime minister. He has twice been in Lillehammer, and I heard him on his party congress last summer, and he talked like Martin Luther King. He's an Albanian prime minister in Montenegro, where the Albanian minority is less than 5%. Congratulations, Dritan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steinar. Yes, these are interesting and very useful examples. What are the results of capacity building? Harald, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, put on my timer. Moving on into school. So skills, capacities that schools are the place where these are handed on. If things work out fine, I only have 2 slides to just explain to you the setting in which we try to, and I have to move on here really with this. The procedure, the setting in which we apply or train narrative dialogue techniques, and for this I have to explain that we tend to go as even a step further before dialogue, and that's the narrative step. The reason for that being a narrative means totally different than is generally held. Narrative means really to share a story that you personally have experienced and share this with others. So that has nothing to do with narrative in a sense of identity. And I wonderfully agree with them. I mean, Mohammed's example, the narrative debate, if you debate, if you have identity debates, you never end, and you're getting heated heads and just, exchange arguments and counter arguments as you have been doing this for years. So this is the reason why we try to get to narratives in the sense of sharing personal experiences, not too intimate, but shareable, and try to develop the skill of doing this and do this with young people in order to prepare them to actually be able to participate in a community and in a democracy in the end. And it's actually very simple. We have one class for one semester, and it's only 1 hour. So all we need from a school is 1 hour with a class, and we then divide the class into groups so that we have 10 to 13 people in a group, and we have 2 facilitators in each group. And as I already mentioned before, we have a 5th colleague with us that has then is waiting and being ready in a timeout area, for anybody who needs a break or for whatever reason. And having 5 people for this 1 weekly hour in school means that we can also divide the 2 groups of 10 to 13, so we end up with smaller groups, just in case narrative and dialogue just doesn't come about very easily. So that's our ground setting, and it's just no rules apply. I mean, rules apply, but no topics are set. Very important. You go in there. How is it going? How are you doing at school or in life? Talk whatever you want to talk, and we help you with that. And the facilitators are trained, and that's quite a job actually, to not discuss and not debate, but just encourage the students and help them to share experiences. That's what we call the narrative dialogue techniques. Now that's the setting. We have a couple of mediation settings for particular situations on reserve. And just to give you the 2 simple tricks that talk about capacities for for facilitators that I train my team in, who come from civic society, from civic education, and tend to debate and argue a lot. And we train each other in asking how and what question, and avoiding as best we can any why question. I recommend that as an experiment for each and all of you. Just go through life a day or two and don't ask why at all, and try to ask how. For instance, if you said you don't like foreigners, can you tell me what you experienced with a foreigner and how was that? That sort of the one trick in training and skill inducing is the getting people ready to ask how and what questions, and replace the why questions. And then the second trick, and of course things are much more complex, but I reduce them to these two tricks, is asking about concrete situations or instances. So you said you love Germany and want to protect it. Can you tell me a situation, an instance in which you felt that? How did this happen? How did it come along? What happened? Who was part of that? So with basically with these two sets of strategies for intervening and for facilitating narrative dialogue, we go into these groups, and also with lots of knowledge about psychodynamics and group dynamics, of course, as much knowledge as we can get, and induce the skill to share personal experiences. And with that, I stop and give back to Georgie.
Thank you very much. I also will want to ask you, but later on, how popular or how spread this methodology is in Germany. So in how many schools do you apply this methodology? But this is for the future. Now, the third round of questions is about the future. So we have heard the experiences, the challenges, and now my request would be to you to just maybe share some of your thoughts, ideas. What do you think? How we could enhance the international dialogue community? What we could do together? What sort of ideas you will have in this field? And just to kick off the ball, I thought that the first point could be that we could institutionalize our network, and we could, for example, establish the so-called Friends of Dialogue community, and this would take up initiatives, and it could also engage in advocacy for further funding in the EU programs and other projects within the next months. The second point would be that we should go on with this sort of roundtables where we shall deepen the share of information. And then the third one, it is personally me, we shall invite some cities to start this planting of the trees of dialogue in their cities as a symbols, which will all the time remind the people that we need to engage in dialogue. So this is just to kick off the ball. The first, Mila, your thoughts about all this, regardless what I said as well.
Sure. I mean, I think education systems are a great place to start, of course, because people are already there to learn. And so, schools and universities, I think the work that Harold is doing, I think that's very important, and it's not happening enough. Beyond that, I think, people who sign up to learn dialogue outside of an institution, I think most of them are people who already know how to dialogue. So we need to get beyond the people who already know how to dialogue signing up for dialogues. We have to find a way of tapping into a need beyond that group. And I think one thing to be aware of is that the good and the bad news is that there's a lot of uncertainty and to some extent some humility now out there among leaders and decision makers, because the world is so complex and uncertain. And so I think there is a significant awareness that business as usual is not working, that our habitual ways of conversing and leading are not sufficient. Last week I was in the Netherlands talking to a group of spatial planners, and they said, you know, no matter what decision they take, someone's getting upset because it's a polarized society and people are very angry and protesting and so on. And we were talking about what capabilities do they need to build. At first they were trying to say, how can we get society to agree? Can we get rid of the polarization? But then another way of looking at it is, maybe your society is just not going to ever be as cohesive as it was 100 years ago when you developed your spatial planning techniques, and you actually need to build capabilities to work in a more polarized society. Understand that your society will not agree, and you as spatial planners and decision makers need a new set of capabilities to work in that divided society where disagreement will be a condition that you're working under. It's going to be a fact of life. So how do you learn to navigate differences? And I think that's an invitation to us to build dialogue capabilities and maybe to tap into that that logic. Another thing I just want to mention is that in RIOS, we're talking a lot about the need to remove the obstacles. And I think this focus on individuals needing to build capabilities for dialogue is one thing, but there are also obstacles to dialogue. And is there some way for us to collaborate in removing obstacles to dialogue? And I think one of the obstacles currently is our information and media environment, of course. I mean, that's a big thing to tackle, but in RIOS, we've started something called the Shared Realities Project, which is looking at how our information ecosystem and mis and disinformation is undermining social cohesion, but then also how polarization makes us more vulnerable to mis and disinformation and the kinds of situations that Harold is presenting. So could we actually create a vision of shifting that cycle to a cycle where a healthy information environment is fueling social cohesion, and social cohesion is fueling a healthy information environment? How do we understand the underlying structures and incentives that are actually fueling that vicious cycle, including the financial incentives and the kind of structural level, not just the level of capabilities, but the structures that are actually fueling that cycle? And could we find ways of working on those obstacles? So those are big asks, tall asks, but it's harder than planting trees. I know that, George. But anyway, it's just some thoughts for the conversation.
Thank you very much. We speak freely, although time is very short, and I would say that we shall prolong a bit our session, so you will have still time for questions, I say, to the audience, or for some brainstorming. But right now, I give the floor to Steinar.
Thank you, Tatar. I'm glad you are flexible enough to go a little bit out of your time frame, because things take time. Dialogue takes time. Even just to warm up to a good conversation takes time. And not only the conversation and the dialogue meeting, I think in terms of developing a culture of dialogue, particularly in conflict areas, we talk about a generational approach. And in North Macedonia, we have been very, very slow trying to look at the educational system, because you cannot come in and say, hey, you shouldn't be segregated, you should go to school together. I mean, who am I, or who are we talking about this? In the Nansen offices, there have been different ethnic groups working jointly together. In a small community, Jegunovce, outside Skopje, we started by talking to parents. What do you feel you need? We didn't examine the needs. We didn't analyze the needs. We just made a report. This is what parents feel they need. And a lot of things we couldn't do anything about, but they wanted better data education and better education in English. So we started to offer that. And we started to offer help fixing classrooms, fixing toilets, being somewhat good guys. And in order to give these classes, we had to bus the children, because we couldn't do it in every village. And since these villages were segregated, when we bused the kids, they came together and they discovered they don't know each other's language. So they say, it would be nice if we also could have some classes learning each other's language. And 3-4 years later, we opened the first nonsense school in this municipality. This was like a model school, and we had to create a new curriculum, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, that was based on an analysis of all textbooks produced in the North Macedonia. The problem with the textbooks were not that they were so biased and full of stereotypes. The main problem of the textbooks, they made the others invisible. So the problem is that Albanians don't know much about Macedonians. Macedonians don't know much about the Turkish people. You know, they will score lousy on a quiz. We worked in Stromica, where Zoran Zaev was the mayor, and he got very involved in this way of thinking. And when he ran for prime minister of North Macedonia, he had the concept, one society for all. And he won the election, and the government has introduced the program, One Society for All. And we have responsibility for developing the strategy, the educational component from 2023 to 2026. So this is a good example of long-term work starting in the early 2000s and 20 years later, reaching at least where we feel that we can have some influence. And dialogue, of course, will be a very important topic. So children become visible to each other at a very early age. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harald.
Thanks, Georgie. Now, I originally had a slightly different plan. I will run you through a few slides, which then, as I said, you're going to get through Georgie. And there's also a piece written on how the young man that brought forward his idea about the Holocaust and clearly was breathing sort of his parents and uncles' views. How in a sequence of 2 sessions, actually, the whole group worked on that almost subconsciously in a quite successful way. But that's a bit too complex, and I want at least get 1 or 2 minutes for the George's most important question about future, where we go with that. But this is what you get with the slides there, and I'm just imagining the young person, bragging in that way in the group, and what facilitators did not do is contradict or correct the young man or introduce historical facts or any of that, because as we know, these things just don't work with these kinds of young people. But instead, what they did is build relation and dialogue with them and with the young man in particular, but also with the group around him, and slightly saying, well, I don't agree with your opinion about your Holocaust, but tell me where you come from. How come you think that? Do you often talk about these situations? With whom do you talk about that? Tell me about these people. What do you experience with your friends or colleagues or uncles or fathers, whoever it is? Yeah. Tell me more about situations when you present that stuff. And all these ways how you can get a young person who trusts you expand a little bit more and share a little bit more of what his or her life actually is. And then the second step then is address the group and get their feedback. I make it very short now in order to not lose too much time, because the group, each of these members, we don't have any conflicts to mediate there, but they're all different. They share different reactions to this input. And then go back to the young man and place this ultimately narrative question of whether he thinks he's a cruel person, And this is, if he trusts you as facilitators, he will think about that hard. And if I ask him, well, can you tell me about a time or about a situation in your life where you might have been cruel? Because actually what you said about the Holocaust is kind of cruel. And the funny thing is, we gave that homework actually to the whole of the group, and they all were sent back home thinking about whether they are cruel or not. And the thing is that they actually did that. So the first result, which is not always the case if we in our group work, we're not teachers, we don't have much authority. We give homeworks all the time as an inspiration, but they did. They thought about this question. That was the first result. And then actually before the next session, the young man and, 2 classmates came around and said, well, we thought about that. We found we're not cruel. We just don't have any strong feelings in general. We're rather apathetic. And that astonished me a lot, because that's quite, if you do therapy, you're happy to get to this point after a couple of sessions. Yeah, they came along with that after a week. And then the group started, they started to talk about death, dying, and sadness. Not the 3 of them, but they did. And then the young man who presented this crude ideas about Holocaust and told something from his family when his grandmother passed away, and he wondered why his father didn't move at all and didn't show any emotions. And he actually arrived at the conclusion, well, I'm sure my parents wouldn't be sad if I died. That was the position he settled after the 3rd week. And here is where this little case story comes at a very hasty end. Sorry about the rush. That I think showed us that we probably onto some form of civic education. I just leave it at that. Civic education 2.0 is something that we need, that gets us beyond what we usually had as civic education, which much rather goes into biographical memory, into sharing of stories, and also into emotional intelligence. It's quite hard to teach, quite hard to facilitate, but if you are in schools and if you have a school government and a ministry who agrees that there should be 1 hour a week for these young people to engage in such an endeavor, I think that is something that I'm probably not going to get done in Germany, but I will not stop trying to do that. And that's my answer to your question, Georgie. I think we need to talk to education ministries and to education policies in order to allow new forms of civic education that go far beyond what we know as civic education, which are dialogical, they're narrative, they are all sorts of things, but they are not debates and discussions anymore, or at least not only. And here I stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very important in the field of, as also Mille said, we need a lot to do in the field of education to widen the scope and to spread this curricula of dialogue and the culture of dialogue. Now I've got the message from Mohammed that in 5 minutes he needs to leave. Practically the panel is over. The next point would be that you could pose some questions, but I would like now to offer to Mohammed, if Mohammed, you do have any sort of comment or anything what you would like to add to this, please say it, and then we shall ask, or meanwhile I will ask the colleagues to raise their hands to see how many would like to pose any question. We don't have too much time, but we shall make our best to give some responses. So firstly, the floor is for Mohammed. Are you here with us, Mohammed?
Yes, I'm here with you. Thank you very much. There are 4 points I wanted to mention for that relate to what some of the colleagues mentioned earlier. And I really first of all, very much appreciate what was said. I think it was very representative of good practices, people that have had their hands in the real issues of dialogue, and that difficult dialogue. The 4 points I want to mention are, first of all, we need to put a great deal of focus on facilitators training. Facilitators can be the ones that can bring the success, but also can be the ones that can bring the damage. One thing we learned is that when you have two identities in dialogue, you need a team of 2 facilitators. It's very difficult to have one identity facilitating 2 separate groups. It's always better to have representatives of the two identity groups, and they need to go through a great deal of training. I mean, one of the main projects that we do in my institution is teachers training or facilitators training, not only for our organization, but also for, let's call it, for the whole industry of dialogue in Israel-Palestine, so that all the trainees come not just for technical university training or facilitation, but something that is more specific to how to facilitate a Jewish-Arab dialogue, which has different angles that are beyond just the technical theoretic work that you study. The second, whenever we do dialogue, it's important to identify physical proximity between people that are engaged in dialogue, mainly because about the post-dialogue process. So when we bring schools together, we try to make sure that the schools are of physical proximity so that the kids have that potential and chance that they might, bump into each other in a shopping mall or in a supermarket or at McDonald's, and they might engage in some further socialization without the engineering of the NGOs. Our exit strategy is to equip people with the tools and skills to live in a shared society, and we always need to think about our exit from this field. We're not there to facilitate every engagement with them, and the question is always, what do we equip them with? The last is that we often think about dialogue as one-time intervention. You come in, you intervene for 1 day, 2 days, 3 consecutive days, and go. What we found very important is to battle with the evaporation or lost impact that happens, is that it's better to do, for example, 3 separate interventions. Like instead of having a 3-day conference, it's better, or 3-day workshop of participants, it's better to have 3 separate days, 1 every 2 weeks. And why? Because it's like vaccination. It's exactly the concept of vaccination. You give them the first shot, they go home, they face all of the rejections from their community, they come back with all of the objections that they got from their community, they get their second shot, they go home again, they have the exchange with their environment, and then they go home with the third set of questions that they meet and the objections that they meet in their society. So the approach needs to be in dialogue with the environment. You're not only bringing dialogue with your immediate participants. Each one brings in a whole set of other people. They bring their parents, they bring their constituency, they bring their community, they bring their teachers, they bring their history, and they bring their present. And we need to be in dialogue with all of those in the room. If you only dialogue with the participants as individuals, you are in a way keeping a sterile environment, which is fake. You need to try to bring in that environment and maybe pollute the dialogue. Let's use that word, but it makes it realistic dialogue. It makes it something that engages with the outside atmosphere and allows the participants to feel that they are immune to be now sent back to their community to engage in defense of the culture of dialogue, which a couple of my colleagues have used the term culture of dialogue, not to use, so that our end client is not just a participant, our end client is the community that they represent.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for this food for thought. And so far I see, if you wish to leave, definitely feel free to leave us.
Unfortunately, I need to start
regrettable,
another
but
meeting very soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much
Thank you
for
very
the
much.
opportunity.
All the best to you. So let me ask also my colleagues, do they see any hands raised? If for questions or not, please also feel free to share your suggestions, ideas with us. If you don't have it, then I will also maybe ask our panelists, firstly, whether they have some food for thoughts. Oh, Liberata. Yes, please, the floor is yours.
Well,
Yes.
Hello.
Liberata is,
can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for organizing this conversation. I'm just been playing between being in Parliament, but this conversation was very interesting. So I wanted to thank everyone, the panelists, for this very informative and I must say very impressive, because the approaches that each and every panelist presented, it is a food for thought. Because when we talk of dialogue, and this is a question I want to put to all of them, people tend to confuse it with negotiations. Because in any peace process, there is negotiations for peace talks. But then what I'm gathering here, I think for some of us who have participated in these negotiations, I think the dialogue comes first and foremost before you start even negotiations. So I don't know whether I'm getting to semantics, but I see the approaches that you have all addressed. I think we need to go deeper and really understand what are we talking about here. But two, I'm happy that Mohammed touched on it, is the role of the facilitators, the third parties. It can be positive, it can be negative. But then can we have dialogue without the facilitators? What works best? The direct dialogue, direct negotiations, or it has been like a trend or a stereotype that for dialogue to succeed, you need facilitators. 3, 2, 1. So this is also why I really wanted to hear your thoughts. How do you see the role of facilitators? Because that's what's normally the approach of the international community or the UN. They always need to get a facilitator. Is it really necessary? Can we do away with facilitators and be able to encourage more direct dialogue between the parties? I thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought that I would give the floor to the panelists for food for thought, but the question is so important that please, each of you, if you have any sort of response to any part of these very general and very specific, at the same time very specific questions, please feel free to come up, and let's make in the sequences as we started. Mile, firstly, the floor is yours. We do have not much time, 8 minutes, but please try to each of you to have to share your time.
Sure. So thank you, Liberata. I think the points that you made are very important. We often will make explicit in our processes, this is not a negotiation, and to distinguish between negotiation and dialogue. And I actually had one of the chief negotiators from the Colombian peace process in our office recently, and he was listening to what we were doing, and he said, negotiating an agreement is one thing, but what you're doing is working on the underlying attitudes and mindsets and capabilities of society, which is in some ways a harder task. And it's if that work is done, then it enables the work that he's doing. So as you said, if you can have dialogue before negotiation, then you'll have a healthier negotiation. Negotiation is needed as well, but if you can do it on a foundation of dialogue and have the two complementing each other, that's ideal. And I think in terms of dialogue without facilitators, it's just about building the if you build the capability and the culture and the practice of dialogue, then there's no need for a facilitator necessarily any longer. It depends on group size and so on as well, but certainly dialogue does not depend on a facilitator if the capability and the practice is there. And just to highlight, I think what Mohammed said is really important, not to understand that people, it's not like you create a dialogue and everyone sits in a circle and then that is a whole that's disconnected from everything else. Every person in that circle has other wholes that they're a part of, communities, organizations, and people that they interact with who are putting pressure on them as well, and who they have to go home to and explain what they've participated in and somehow interact with. And so this ecosystem approach, I think, is very important. People being able to go in and out of the dialogue, and us having that much broader perspective of the people who our participants are influencing and influenced by. So I really appreciate that big perspective and systemic perspective that he just brought in.
Thank you very much. Steinar, the floor is yours.
Yes, I also completely agree that, of course, dialogue and mediation, negotiation is different things. Dialogue primarily is a way of communicating to increase the understanding of each other, or even to increase the understanding of why the conflict is so difficult to solve. Dialogue does not replace negotiation, but it's kind of a component of the process that should be before the negotiation. If you go straight into a negotiation, you might end up in a frozen situation with no movement. Dialogue can help to create movement in frozen situations, because you get like a different perspective on exactly why the conflict is so hard. And often people in conflicts, they are not even agreeing upon what it is they are fighting about. I'm very involved now in the war in Ukraine, and it started with people in Donbass, Ukrainians living in Donbass, revolting against Kiev. Kiev was so sure that Russia was behind, so they hit back strongly instead of trying to charm and keep Donbass as an integrated part of Ukraine. And Moscow is so sure that United States is behind Kiev, so they also hit strongly back. You have 3 layers of war on top of each other, and the people who really pay the price were the civilians living there, and most of them have escaped to Europe or to Russia. I think that the strength of dialogue, and this will be my last point, is that when people start to share their stories, when they start to tell how their grandparents, how their families somehow shaped their understanding of history, what happened, and you realize, if I had been born in your family, I would have started to talk the language you talk. If I had had your grandfather, I would have heard completely different stories about the war. If I had been you, I probably would have been thinking quite a bit like you. And it's kind of crazy that we are ready to kill each other when it's pure coincidence that you were born in the Serbian North Mitrovica, I was born in the Albanian South Mitrovica. And realizing that somehow we have a common interest in transcending this kind of division, this is where the dialogue comes in. Without the dialogue, there is no way that I can understand that if I had been you, I probably would have been thinking a lot like you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that Josh Nadau is raising hands, but I would like to to ask Harald if you have anything maybe within 1 minute to share with us, and then I would also ask Josh Nadau to pose his question maybe to somebody directly, just not to leave anybody without any response. So, Harald, firstly. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, he had to go for the children. He wrote a message.
Josh? Josh?
No, Harald.
Ah, Harald. Okay. Then sorry, I haven't seen that. Then, Josh, the floor is yours. Please pose your question.
Thank you very much, everybody, for all the different points of view and for all the resources that you've been sharing. It's, again, a very general question, but I also work with the Ukrainian and Russian context right now. And there's a lot of debate over whether it's time for dialogue or what's possible, especially with the parties themselves possibly not being ready. That's something that's debatable, but I'm curious about what advice we can give to people who think that it's not possible now. What seeds can we plant now that can help prepare the way for processes in the future? I know we said facilitator training was one, but I'm wondering if there's any other quick insights that might help developing facilitator communities to prepare. Thank you.
I would give now the floor firstly to Steinar, because he's dealing with Ukraine and Russia, and then Mila, if you had anything to add, then or to please feel free. So firstly, Steinar, floor is yours.
Yes, I know Josh very well. We have been together in several meetings with Ukrainians and Russians, and we had the summer schools in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, and then they stopped. And I am right now in the process of talking to Ukrainians and Russians, and Josh is right. Most Ukrainians I talk to have absolutely no interest in having dialogue with Russians. It means to show them one respect they don't have. It means to show them, to honor them in a way they don't want. And in that kind of situation, it's extremely, extremely difficult. But there is always there is always one or two or three or four or five that you can gather on each side, and you have to start somewhere. So the best seed from my experience are those 10 people that you can gather. And I know recruiting them is difficult, but if they come together and start to talk about how they perceive, how they experience the conflict, they will go back home with some kind of energy, and they will tell the stories. So the people that are participating are actually the seeds that will make it possible to have 10 new people and 10 new people. This is how we worked in the Western Balkan. And we started before the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina was over. The Dayton Agreement happened while we had people sitting together. So it's never too early to start with dialogue. It's sometimes too late.
Thank you very much. That's very important what you said. Also, the situation is very difficult. Mila, please go ahead.
I agree with Steiner. I don't have anything to add now. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think with this very how to say, on one part, a very encouraging remark made by Steinar, that we need to do dialogue. We need to follow up situations which, even if situations are very conflictual and people don't talk to each other, they are in hostile situations, we need to do something. Sometimes for the others who are not in this community, in my view, all our efforts look as idealistic, illusion, whatever. And I think that's why we need to enhance our voice, to speak up and to explain to them that in any situation there is a possibility to intervene and to engage in dialogue, at least to make some efforts for that. It would pay off. Definitely. And secondly, that there are many methodologies, many tools through which you are able to develop this dialogue process. Now, by this, the webinar is practically over. I would like to ask any of you who remained with us until this very end, that even if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, please feel free to share with me, to share with us this, and we shall try to further develop this cooperation, this collaboration, and this sort of specific sort of dialogue. And I will want to also warn you that we shall disseminate, circulate this the record of this event, and then we shall continue our relations and our collaboration. So thank you very much for this. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. And see you very soon around another roundtable when we shall more deeply discuss another topic or topics. Thank you very much. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Liberata. All the best. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. 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 Bye.